Influence policies on early childhood. And like many social experiments, it's got its issues. And we're going to address those issues and try to summarize the effect of this program, what we could call the effect. I mean, the term the effect is often used, and it's multiple interpretations sometimes cause difficulty even in discussion, because there are many ways to describe a program. And in some sense, what we want to do is boil down multiple interpretations and then end up with what economists like, which is a very aggregative measure that simply takes all of these multiple treatment effects into a number called a rate of return, the sort of annual rate of return per dollar invested at the beginning of life, and or a cost or benefit cost analysis. So what we also need to do here, and I think it's really an essential part of all analyses of experiments, there are some very perfect experiments, and they're very rare. Mostly we need to think about supplementing experimental data using non-experimental data and what I would call structural econometric methods. And I'll define what I mean. It's very general. I'm not going to get down to specific functional forms or anything of the sort, but we are going to think about specifically how to use and supplement the data, and you'll see why we need to do it. But I would point out that in the literature there's been a lot of discussion about causal models and structural models, and all I'm saying is, and it's not a main theme of this talk, but it shows up repeatedly, there really is no conflict. There really is no conflict. And so, and I would emphasize the third bullet point, that no particular form of data is privileged here. And you'll see why. I mean, experiments are very rich, but additional data help us even interpret the experiments further. So, and again, another phrase that's, oops, looks like I have an issue here. But let's see if I can close it. So is that many people, you hear the phrase commonly tossed around about randomization as the gold standard. It's a source of variation, and I think it's a very rich source of variation, and we're going to use a randomized controlled trial with long-term follow-up. But it's got its problems, and we think we can solve those problems, or at least address them and suggest how sensitive the results are to the solutions that we adopt. So this is the description. This is borrowed from The Blind Man and the Elephant. I mean, we think about this program. Think of ABC as this elephant. And various people are walking around. The ABC Care program we'll define. It's an early childhood program that starts at 8 weeks of life and goes up through 8 years of age. And it's followed, the people in this program are followed through their mid-30s. So this program, I mean, this is kind of the paradigm that we're thinking about. I'm giving you all of the discussions about the program. It costs a lot of money, $80,000 per kid over the whole life of the project. It supports child care, but it's very costly. It seems to only work for girls. It looks at self-reported crime and has no effect. And the program is too old to be informative, and there's a lot of problems because the control group had choices, and controlling for those choices could pose a serious problem. And what we want to end up with is this slide, which is having the blinders taken off and simply say, look, it is effective, and it's effective through multiple dimensions. And if we look at this program, it's not that I'm trying to sell you this particular program. In fact, I think that's a huge mistake. But I'm going to sell you the idea that programs like this, or programs that have ingredients like these, can be very effective. So without further introduction here, let me just go through. So we present here a framework for benefit cost analysis and rate of return analysis. We want to consider ways to understand whether or not this program competes favorably with other public projects. Benefit cost analysis has kind of fallen out of favor in many quarters, is very unfashionable, and in some sense it is. It can be a lot of dull empirical work where one basically has to be very careful, and a lot of controversy. But it's still really important. At least I hope it's important. Maybe in another day it'll be important. Who knows? But it is, I think, it is important to actually consider how, if we have public funds, or for that matter, private funds, which, and there are, hedge fund billionaires who are investing in social efficiency bonds, looking at exactly these programs, or programs like it. How does it compete? So if we were to compare a program that was like building a road or an airport, or for that matter, a job training program, or building another school. How did this program compare? So this will give us some way to think about it. But what are the empirical challenges? And these are what we want to address today. First of all, like many of these interventions, there are hundreds of outcomes, many, many outcomes. So it's a multiplicity of outcomes, and it's a life cycle analysis we have. So we have multiple outcomes over the life cycle. How do you summarize those? You want to look at the treatment effect on education at age 23 and judge the whole program by that? I think it's a mistake. So we're going to try to do this. So we want to consider 4 different metrics for evaluating these multiple outcomes. And we want to show a sense of consistency and, in some cases, some inconsistency, which is interesting about how the program works. And there are some gender differences in the effects of the program measured different ways. So we want to talk about monetizing non-market benefits, because these programs have beneficial effects on things like crime, health, reduction in special education, and so forth. And we know that some of these components, like monetizing the impact of crime and health, those are difficult. I mean, they raise a whole controversial set of issues. How do you evaluate a life? How do you evaluate life expectancy? What is a quality of life? Many things, many issues. So we're going to talk about that. I also want to address, because we have so many different hypotheses, so many different treatment effects, there's a danger in all of these studies, and that is you pick out a few coefficients or a few treatment effects that are statistically significant. And if you have hundreds of those, you're very likely at any level of significance to find some, of the standard levels of significance to find. So if you use a 10% level of significance, about 10% of your outcomes on average will show up as being statistically significant. You want to account for the fact that what's called cherry picking is at work here. You don't want to just pick numbers out that you like. It's very common in the literature, becoming less common. And finally, we want to consider 2 other issues. We want to look at multiple benefits over the life cycle. So we only have data through age 35. If you do a cost-benefit analysis, you're talking about lifetime, or you would like to talk about lifetime. Now, there's a sense in which maybe that's not so important for the following reason. If you kind of discount future outcomes, that the future is heavily discounted by any reasonable rate, time preference, or discount rate. But still, it turns out to make a difference, because some of these benefits, like on health and some of the other, they really are showing up later in the life cycle. So there's an issue. How do we actually extrapolate? There's a literature on doing this, and we'll compare, I think, what is the common way, at least in economics, with a way that we think is more principled. And finally, this point I raised already, that the control group has substitutes. So when you randomly assign somebody to this showed up in the Head Start evaluation recently. I don't know if you followed it, but remember, Head Start evaluation showed up with everybody saying Head Start didn't work. And the reason why it didn't work was they ran a randomized controlled trial, a gold standard trial, and they compared the treatments with the controls. But when people looked a little more closely at what the controls were, you found an awful lot of people who were actually taking Head Start, just somewhere else than at the site they ended. So you were comparing Head Start to Head Start, and, well, doesn't matter much. So when people actually try to adjust for that, they find substantial effects. We find something similar here. And more than just kind of adjusting for a bias, we actually find some interesting aspects, because we can compare treatment effects in programs to those who take one kind of substitute in the control group versus those who not. And who do not. In the particular, we're going to compare people who go into this early childhood program. It's a very enriched program, with people who stay at home with their parents, and these are typically disadvantaged homes, or who go to alternative child care center, and those typically are much lower quality than this one. So we'll show you what the effects are. So that's the goal. And these are the contributions, so we're going to skip that. So let me just find we will talk about this, but we better get into the substance here. So the contribution, though, I would say, is we want to consider something that's robust. Now, that word is thrown around a lot, and I think in this case we have established robustness in many, many components. So there's a question about estimating. When you're adding equations to, make forecasts, you need to account for both forecast error and estimation error. There's a question about using some of these samples and making particular functional forms, how much the estimates depend on that. And then there's a whole question about quantifying non-market costs. It's a big controversy. And so that's what that's what we're going to talk about. So let me just tell you what the effects are of the program, and then we'll get into some of the data and the methodology. So the program has substantial benefits on health, the earnings of participants, crime, education, and earnings, although the effects differ by gender. So there are some strong gender differences. And the quantitative assessment of those, the dollar valuation, is really important. What we find, though, is when we aggregate all of these findings, make forecasts, and then do a sensitivity analysis, if the overall rate of return is about 13% per annum, maybe a little higher in that range, with a benefit cost ratio of 6.3. And that is after you account for what a lot of economists really insist on accounting for, the welfare cost of raising taxes to finance the program. So it's not just a question of saying, here, this program works, if we just get money out of the sky. We're considering that raising $1 of revenue has substantial costs in terms of people substituting against work and trying other kinds of substitution. And then what we do is we have an extensive range of sensitivity analyses. And we're going to estimate the overall benefit cost ratio, and this is a big range, no question, about 1.52 to 17.4. And we'll show you the range. Well, there's a big range, and I'll show you how we get those ranges. And that maps into an internal rate of return about 8 to 18%. Now, you know, the benchmark benefit cost ratio would be 1, so we're still above the 1. So this is basically another summary of what's going on. These are the median present value of the main components of the benefit cost analysis. So the total benefits are over here, right? The effects on labor income of the individuals, the effects on parental labor income. It's a child care program, and there's a real issue in economics whether or not you want to count that. And so we'll show you results with and without that. But there really is an issue that this program is 8 hours a day of child care, actually a little longer. As a result, many of the mothers in the program could go to work. Not only go to work, but go to school. So there were lifetime intergenerational effects for the mothers and for the children. And then there were also effects on health. And quantifying the health benefits is a whole issue by itself. So this is the graphic of what our benefit cost ratios are. This plots a range of different estimates for women and for men. Okay? So this is just a distribution under a variety of different assumptions. We'll go through some of those assumptions, but this is basically what the plot is, and then the overall average is this dotted line. So what you can see is, you know, that there is some variability, and some of the lower bound estimates are going to get you near 0 for this group, but for the males it's pretty high. And even in what we think is worst case situations, you get a strong effect. And if you look at the internal rate of return, the rate of return like a passbook savings, it's concentrated away from 0. It's concentrated here at a very high level, and this should be decimal points. That's like 5% rate of return, 10% rate of return. And then we can talk about distribution. So we want to get into that. And this is the graphic. This is the ultimate, if you will. I don't know if it's the ultimate. But if we take apart each of the components of the benefit cost analysis, we ask, what are the consequences if we only consider crime? If we only consider the benefits on crime and health together, and then we look at labor income of the people, the health, and so forth. So this is like a Venn diagram, and you can see that the overall rate of return is this when you put together all the ingredients. But if you take them out, you can get these different components one at a time, and you can see those as both the rate of return and the benefit cost ratio. So we're going to lead up to that. And this is an important finding, that I think that there are beneficial treatment effects for girls, more beneficial effects for the young girls in the program. But when you monetize the benefits, it's bigger for boys. And that's partly because there's a big effect on crime, and crime is very costly. There are substantial benefits for health as measured by the quality of adjusted life and life expectancy, health care costs, but that's primarily for men. Very weak effects for women, for the young girls. It's child care for mothers, facilitates work, I already mentioned that. Crime, earnings gains. Education, primary effects for women. There are some effects for men, and what's interesting is that in these programs, if you start early enough, there appear to be lasting effects on IQ. So we can actually then boost IQ. So these are the treatment effects. And so here, when do you want to take over, Jorge? At any time, you can seize the day. So here, let me just describe the experiment and then let Jorge speak, because he really, he's really, as I say, the senior author on this paper. So the ABC Care experiment was something launched about 40 years ago. And by the way, we're surveying these people now. We just finished a new questionnaire to go out into the field later this year or early next year to follow these people up at age 45. Right now, the data we have is starting in the mid-30s. So we have two very similar programs launched in North Carolina, basically Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill area. They were all disadvantaged people, not exclusively African American, but primarily. They start early at 8 weeks and they go through age 5. There's a second round with a second round randomization that has very weak effects, and we're not going to worry about that. That's a second stage effect. We don't find very strong effects, and so we're not going to really talk about that, but we'll still talk about the costs of that program. So I don't know if we want to go through all the details of the program. Any questions? Or I guess the format is I should keep talking and then you ask questions, but that's bad because here's where the question is naturally occurring anyway. So the goal was at the time, and this is a whole evolution of thinking in these early childhood programs. At the time, it was designed, this program, to boost IQ. I mean, the whole issue was IQ. And so under the influence of cognitive psychology, the idea was that the be-all and end-all was either an IQ or maybe an achievement test score. We know now, partly as a result of looking at these programs, that these social and emotional non-cognitive skills are very, very important. And they do actually play a big role here. But anyway, that was the goal. But it was a very intensive program compared to many other programs. So the kids had access to health screenings, the treatment group. They didn't get the cost of medication paid, but they did have access to medical care in a sense of looking. So it was a fairly intensive program, 8 hours a day, at least through age 5, through the beginning of a kindergarten, and then followed. Subsidized child care, I already mentioned that. And this particular program is a prototype for a huge number of programs in place today and being planned. So it's not like we're talking about some ancient history. This is the prototype. The IHDP program that Jeannie Brooks Gunn has worked on, that is cloned out of this program. Early Head Start has ingredients in it. And there are programs all around the world. And I keep finding more than 20 Educare programs have been launched over the US, and Educare is an enriched version of this. So if you're interested in Educare, you can think of what we're doing here is looking at a lower bound than what Educare can do. So the control and treatment groups are very small, and this has been a recurring issue. And so people say, I mean, it says belief out there that somehow you need a sample size of 100 maybe, or I don't know, some people come up with 200 or 1,000 or no such rule. I mean, we've done a lot of work applying both exact small sample inference and asymptotic inference. And in a paper we published in 2014 in Science, we actually found that the asymptotic inference that we obtained compared to permutation-based small sample inference were basically very, very similar. So that I don't think is an issue. So we're gonna go with the large sample theory, but we have versions of parts of what we're doing in their permutation. Hard to get estimators with a permutation-based inference.
The literature on this abecedarian project, is this the same thing?
Yes.
Subset of it?
No, this is the abecedarian. This is it. Okay. This is abecedarian, but also following up with CARE. CARE was like a follow-up that was a few years after the first program ended. It was really almost the same. When I say almost the same, there were slight differences. But when you test for whether or not you can pool the sampling, you look at the treatment effects, they're basically indistinguishable. So this is it. So the two programs that are kind of salient out there are PERI, where we're analyzing the data right now at age 55 of the PERI people. And then when you have people at age 45 now in the ABC. So those are the two iconic programs, out of which many programs have been built. Now the one feature about this program, which actually makes things simple for us, is that virtually, I mean, not everybody, but we're talking like 95, 98%, all the people who offer treatment accept it. So economists would think about this as like revealed preference. They knew what they were getting, or they thought they knew what they would get here compared to what they had either at home or in a treatment center somewhere else, and they opted for this if offered it. So it's not, non-compliance is really not an issue for the treatment arm. People are complying fully, we think. There is attrition related to health. Children died in the course of this, and some parents moved. So let me just go over, so how much time do I have left? I should really be careful. How much?
30 minutes.
30 minutes. Oh, okay. Well, that's pretty good. I'll take 5 more minutes and then... No. So we have a panel. We have a panel. And so just, this is a simple schematic. It's kind of clumsy. I mean, you could have had an A bar plus 1 here, but it's not. So, but anyway, so here's a treatment period, a follow-up period up to age A star. This is like 35 or so in this sample. And then there's the rest of the life. So if you want to think about it, we don't observe the rest of the life. We stop right here. This is what the follow-up is. We're planning to observe another chunk of it. That's what the new survey is designed to do. And so the individuals are eligible to participate in the program. I'm just going to call this script B0. So this is just basically a high-risk index that was actually a measure of childhood disadvantage, how compromised the homes were. And compromised here meant in particular mother's education. It also meant family income and various other risk factors, housing density and so forth. So there was a risk index that was basically determining eligibility. So we can go through it. But let me just give you the notation, very simple. So W stands for wish. Do you wish to participate? So W equals 1, fine. R equals 1 is basically whether or not you're randomized into the program, and D is participation. So you want to be in the program and you're randomized to it. And what I was saying is that basically everybody who wished to be in the program when they were randomized basically complied. They they participated in the program, but they're randomized to that. So we have a pretty good idea of what's going on for the treatment arm. So full compliance, R equals 1, W equals 1. People are actually all going in. And so this is what I already said, so I'm not going to repeat that. And then we have the outcome vector with treatment, and then we have the outcome vector without treatment. So we have treatment and not, but now no treatment itself has 2 treatments. There could be multiple treatments, but for today we're going to talk about 2. So it turns out that there's a fair number of people. This is the proportion of months in alternative preschools for the control group. Okay? So you can see that over the course of the first 5 years, this is like the fraction of those months that are spent. It's pretty substantial that you're getting this distribution. This is a distribution function, not the density. So you can say there's compromise, and you know the usual issue is to kind of say, oh, this is a big problem, we should avoid it. I would say it's a source of information. We'll try to show it. So here, just the notation is we have basically child care at home, H for home, and C stands for center. Okay, so home and center, and then basically we have 2 outcomes. This is the counterfactual. This individual, age A is the age where we're measuring this thing. This could be a vector too. But anyway, this is the control subject to received home care exclusively or some other alternative child care. Now, if you go back to this diagram, you can see that there's a whole continuum. But we do have some limited number of observations in the control sample. So we make a judgment, and we do some sensitivity tests on the judgment of partitioning this way. People who got exclusively home care, and there was a chunk, about 20-25% of the people only never took alternative among the control groups, but some of the others had alternative. And we play with different definitions, but we discretize that out of empirical necessity. And so basically we have, do you participate in some program? In this case here, it would be V equals 1 if you go into a formal center and you're in the control group, or just you go into the formal center. Let me not condition it here. And then 1 minus V would equal to 1 if basically you have V equal to 0. You stay at home. So we have this. So this is just another, this is a treatment effect on a treatment effect within it. And so what are the two parameters of interest here we want to estimate? So if you just go into the world of treatment effects, which is what we've gone into, the standard approach of saying here, it's like a weight. You're going to compare this against the next best. And so the next best is either, if you think that parents, you don't have to argue that they're maximizing utility, whatever they see, this versus the alternative. So remember, why not is the next best, which is a composite of those two things. But we also encode this idea that people who want to go in, everybody who's eligible wants to go in if they're offered the opportunity. So that helps identify. So that's the late. That's what an experiment would identify, okay? And that's equation 2. But there are other parameters of interest. And the other parameters of interest would be the gain here, okay, if people decide to stay at home. This is the gain of being in the program formally versus staying at home. And the other, an analogous parameter would be this parameter for people going to a center. So we have two different treatment effects, right? We have a bunch of different. We could have more than this, but at least these two. So we're going to consider these and estimate these as well. And here is where the experiment is not going to give you direct information. There's a choice going on here. And you have to control in some way for the choice. And we do that in a variety of different ways. Instrumental variable strategies, selection models, and also batching. And we basically end up with the same inference, but much more precise estimates when we use some form of matching. So you need non-experimental methods, and that's the way. So then the question becomes, how can you summarize? This is like walking around the elephant. We have a lot of these outcomes. How do we summarize those outcomes? And so literally, there are at least 4 ways, and we present evidence on all 4 approaches. First, we can then say, look, we have a whole variety of blocks of multiple hypotheses. We have health, we have crime, we have education, we have earnings, and so forth. So within each of those blocks of hypotheses, we can imagine doing what's called step-down multiple hypotheses. This corrects for the bias that comes from picking the best, the smallest p-value. So this is an adjustment. So this is a standard method now, widely used, and we're going to use it here. That's one way to summarize. Blocks of interpretable outcomes, and we break it down by gender as well to see if there are gender effects. Another way to do it is basically to summarize each of these blocks. So instead of doing this, instead of looking at each outcome, what we do in this multiple hypothesis testing approach, what we do is we extract factors. And those factors then would be like, think of it as a principal component or some summary of this set of outcomes. And then we ask whether or not the factors that summarize the block are statistically significant. That's another way. That's also used. We also want to consider combining functions. Yes, please.
Is your IQ result that you advertised before, is that the raw IQ score or an IQ factor that you backed out in stage?
It's a raw IQ score. Okay. I mean, that's the raw IQ score. No. And we separate, by the way, the achievement test from the IQ. So we definitely separate it. But no, the result I announced, I'll send you. You can see the graph. It's very, very, I don't have it here, so I'll show it to you later privately. So then they're combining functions, and so we're just asking how many of these results are statistically significant by some measure within each block. That's another way. Combining functions, often used in statistics. We're going to use that, but not spend too much time with that. And then what we're really up to is benefit, cost, and rate of return. This is one number to summarize all of these things. And the question is, how do these 4 approaches agree? So we have these 4 different approaches. And now, you want to take over? You can take over at any time. I'm happy to surrender the podium. So first of all, the step-down block analysis. Men are more likely to be employed. They receive higher labor income, fewer felony arrests, better health. Women are more likely to graduate from high school, positive net effects on their employment. For female income, less, and fewer felony arrests. We don't have the children of the participants, although we have a new study on Perry. We just got these results where we actually have the children of the Perry participants. So we can actually look at what's the effect of the program on the children of the participants. So if the mother is engaged in non-market activity, taking care of the child, what are the effects on the children of those individuals? And we find effects into the third generation. So there really are effects. Yes, please.
Question, next to the last, the
Oh, yes.
strong effect on female labor, not as much as for male labor. I guess it's not because the program doesn't do as much for female, but rather it's because the production function for male is different.
Exactly. That's why I was mentioning the idea that part of this is that women would stay at home and they would raise the kids. They would actually participate in non-market activity. And to the extent we can get at that, we can get at it with the Perry program where we have later data. We have data at age 55. Oh my God, we're 15 minutes. Okay, let's Jorge, take over. So anyway, we have a lot of factors. So factors by block. The combining function is basically, I'll just skip over this now because we really have to get to the essence here. So there's a block of similar outcomes indexed by, so what we're doing here is just saying, okay, we got a batch of these treatment effects, and so which treatment effects, what percentage of these treatment effects are positive? That's one way. And another way to say it is what a percentage of these treatment effects are positive and statistically significant. So this is another way. It's a combining function. It's a way to combine. People use these aggregators. So it's basically the proportion of beneficial outcomes by block. You can, anyway, you can show that the null would be like, no effect would be like 50-50, right? If the treatment effects are more or less random, 50% should go one way, to be centered around 0. The actual proportion would be centered around 50% if the treatment effects are centered around 0, because it kind of fluctuates. Here's one that's significant, here's one that isn't, and so forth. So what we find is very strong effects, and I'll just show you. You get basically, if you look at overall treatment effects, you find that, for females, very many program effects. I mean, 80% or so a positive treatment effect, just as a summary. That's across a whole variety of these categories. And if you look for males, those are standard error bars, by the way, adjusted for everything, including estimation error and forecast error when we're forecasting things. And what you get is that for males and females, you still get positive effects. And you can use statistical significance as a measure. So there are many aggregator functions. So that's a crude way. But to anticipate where we'll probably never get, maybe we'll bring it up in the cause discussion, if we ask the question of what's the treatment, okay? So for females, the results hold on. If you look at this one treatment effect, what's the effect of treatment versus staying at home? That's another counterfactual. So for girls, still a strong effect. For boys, really not, right at the 50-50 line. It's interesting, and you'll see, I hope, if you give us a few more hours. So the gender effects differ by category, so I would, here, Jorge, take over. I mean, this is completely unfair for me to monopolize it.
I think you should go over this and then I'll explain the results.
Okay, so let me just go over this briefly. So these are all different ways to explain, but they're not completely in agreement with each other. I mean, if you count the percentage of people who gain, more women women are gaining in more outcomes. You can see that. There's a gender difference. So, if you look at certain treatment effects, so that's the usual issue. You walk around the elephant and you see it in different ways. The tail, the nose, and so forth, the trunk and so forth. So what we do is basically, let me just get to this key question, which is predicting and monetizing life cycle costs and benefits. And this then is a way to aggregate all of these outcomes into a single interpretable number that's widely used. I mean, for example, when Obama was promoting early childhood education, he used one of our estimates on the Perry preschool program, a 10% estimate, and it was very prominent. It's very, very much still featured today in the discussion. So these things are a simple way for people to understand. But the problem is, as I showed you, we have incomplete life cycles. So we need to forecast or some way take account of what's going on after age A star when our sample period ends. And so there's an issue, a whole question about forecasting issue. And the way that a lot of people in the past have worked on this, recently, in the past, I mean papers published 3 months ago, so that's not too far in the past. Those basically are saying, okay, we're going to fit something like the effect of our measure of an achievement test gain and relate earnings to that measure, to achievement test gain, and then forecast life cycle earnings off that one component. We want to argue that's a very inadequate way. It's very incomplete. And we can give a much richer account of what's going on. We'll show you. So,
particular case, what is A star?
oh, A star is around 35. So we're following them to the early years. As I say, we have this sampling out now going to age 45. I mean, you know, 1 decade at a time. So, okay, and so the key here is to add to the empirical data sources to predict out-of-sample outcomes. So if you know this, it's like a form of empirical Bayes, but that's not so important. So the question is, how do you structurally forecast? And so we want to predict life cycle benefits, but we don't observe the life cycles. So there's a real issue about how the relationships between experimental outcomes and later life outcomes. And here, I would say that some of the standard methods that are used, for example, what's the term? Surrogate markers literature in biostatistics, won't quite work here, and I'll explain why. Maybe you don't know what that is, and I'll define what that is as well. But the questions are the relationships between experiments, the experimental outcomes, and later life outcomes like those that would have arisen from the experimental sample? And you got to be careful. So we have data from panel data that are non-experimental, relating things like the test score to earnings, right? Or education to earnings. We know, we have a lot of relationships. We can just fit a relationship. But the problem is that the experiment, if it's truly an experiment, is giving us an ability constant relationship, right? I mean, you're randomizing in some sense, and you're randomizing. You're getting this experimental treatment effect of education. And the non-experimental doesn't do it. So if you use the non-experimental data uncritically, you have to be careful. I mean,
Does that matter when you randomize at 8 weeks, Jim?
What do you mean? No, I'm talking about the fact if I use the data at, say, measure earnings, for example, over the lifetime within a panel data like PSID with the education effect. Yeah, it would matter. It could matter. Because think about it. The experiment, I have the experimental treatment effect on education. I have the experimental treatment effect on earnings. But I don't have the experimental treatment effect of education on earnings. That comes later, right? Because education is partly randomized, it's partly a choice. So that's why it does matter, I think, right? Okay, to be discussed. I take 5 minutes away from his question time. No.
So
Yeah.
that's a classical mediation problem.
Yes, it is. It is.
And it's always hard to know whether the causal effect of the mediator on the outcome. I think people in this room might wonder how you do that, but maybe we'll do that at discussion.
Well, there are different ways. One way is to use instrumental variables. We have, in a paper we published in the AER a few years ago, American Economic Review, we looked at use some method of controlling for unobservables using proxies, and then of course you could try a variety of combination of things like instrumental variables and matching and so forth. So there's a whole literature on that, and we draw on that. We try to draw on that. But the key point is you have to somehow recognize that the non-experimental sample is being generated differently than the experimental sample. And so the forecasting problem is a little more delicate. So, I mean, some of this is trivial, and how much time do I have left?
Just take your time. We're here to 1:50.
Careful, you shouldn't say that. I'll take a lot of time. But requirements, so basically, some of these are just common sense things. I mean, look, we're using data on older people to look at the forecasts of people now who are 30 to 35. So there could be cohort effects, right? And we know that in the earnings data there are substantial cohort effects. So we have to be careful. So what we're going to do is say, okay, we're going to allow for cohort effects. But there are other issues. But the way we're going to approach this forecasting issue, and here I think it's different from what's done in the past, we want to make a key assumption which turns out to be testable. The assumption is the effect of the treatment on outcomes operates through its effect on the inputs creating those outcomes. So if you want to think of like a production function, like the education example we were talking about, I have education and I have earnings. Now, what's the main determinant of education? Well, if I can control for things like ability and of course the education itself and the other mediators, I then can come up with something I want to argue that the technology that maps those mediators to the outcomes is the same between treatment and control. And that turns out to be a testable restriction. That's an interesting, so we want to see that. I mean, in other contexts, we found that to be true on the Perry data, but it's a question. Okay, man, now we have 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
Yes, let's see.
I should just skip past this. That's the basic idea, basically, that what we're saying is that we can, so these are just formalizations saying, you need to be able to have, support. You've got to be able to find your forecast sample has to include the sample that's relevant for the people in your experiment. Those are all kind of common sense conditions. And then the question is, and so I can get out of all this, but what we really need to do is equate, question, yeah.
Relating to that, because earlier you have this example of W. So people who participate in experimental sample are those who were wishing to participate. But in your other non-experimental sample, how do you know who would be wishing, who would not?
I don't. No, that's the problem. I mean, when I have to control. I mean, that's the whole issue about saying in the non-experimental sample, I want to get a counterpart that would correspond to what the experimental sample is. So I then need to think about, the experiment really needs to be, the non-experimental data has to be carefully analyzed. So we get to a kind of a standard problem of using observational data to make causal statements going out of sample. So this is the kind of condition that Prentice and Little and others would be making. Quality of distributions, the notation is dense, but it's basically saying if we can assume the distribution as samples is the same for both rushing through this is not good. But what I'm asking is basically, well, here, let me get to this condition here.
Is this like the restud stuff with the JGPA? The stuff you did when you were comparing experimental and non-experimental evaluations of training, you said the non-experimental data had to be reweighted?
Well, there's a version of that, for sure, in terms of reweighting.
Is this a version of that same insight?
A little different, because what we're really saying is that the experimental effects, that the outcome effects are basically all a consequence of changing certain inputs. And that we didn't have to assume. So this is going one step further. It's getting into what Steve was calling, and correctly, mediation analysis. So we're getting at mediators. That sounds like a strong assumption, but it's been verified in 2 or 3 settings where people have tested it. But I'm going to run out of time. So basically, I think we should talk about the results. I could give you all kinds of results. But what's interesting is that you can partially test these assumptions. Because if we really say that the control group, so just to get rid of all the notation and just to get to the essence of the idea, if we say that these mediators account for the differences, that we should be able to find that the control group, once we have the proper mediators, and the non-experimental comparison group more or less produce the same estimates if we put the same variables in. And that's what we find. And we can only test that up to AJ star. And you go beyond, you're in the future, and you can't necessarily do it. Okay, so I think we should, so there are a bunch of tests that actually verify this, but I think we should talk about the results. Do people want to see the results? Or maybe you don't believe any of the results, so maybe I shouldn't. I'll just talk more about it. But actually, we can do a number of tests, specification tests, and I think we just can't. So here, why don't we then, you want to take over?
Sure.
Okay, good. No, it's a little awkward here, but take over with theorem 1. And okay?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I didn't even use the clicker. Okay, here.
So getting back to your question on how we find a comparable group in the non-experimental sample, this would be a test, because I think, the problem that we have is greatly simplified by the fact that everyone who wishes to enter into the experiment has these background variables that belong to that B0 set. So you can go to the non-experimental sample, ask who has the B0 set, and then deduce that they would wish to participate of the program if the program would have been offered to them, and then we can test them. So
So do you assume that whoever had that set of characteristics
Yeah.
would have
Yeah,
a wish.
because that's what the experiment reveals, in the sense that everyone who was choose to participate of the program, in fact, agreed to participate of the randomization.
And we know what the risk, we know what the enrollment factors were, the eligibility factors, so we'd condition on those informing these kinds of comparison groups. So that's where we're using that result big time, you know, the fact that we got such compliance.
And so here you would have the you would have the synthetic cohort that we construct in the experimental sample, and then run a test at age 30, right? because that's the age in which we observe labor income for those individuals. So you can do this for males and for females, and then an analogous to that would be, now let's test our whole projection. We have a projection for the treatment, we have a projection for the control. So here that assumption is going in two different ways. We're assuming that inputs are what matter to generate the treatment, and inputs are what matter to explain who is in the experimental sample and who is in the non-experimental sample. So this structural invariance assumption is going both across the treatment and the control and the experiment and the non-experiment. And this picture is testing both at the same time, because it's giving the treatment here in gray, that's the trajectory that we forecast for labor income, and then for the control. But then we can also ask if at age 30 our prediction was good or bad, and it turns out to be pretty good. So that's for males, that's for females, and this is an example of what we do using labor income, because labor income is the easiest to construct. But we do exactly the same thing to forecast health. But that's a much more difficult exercise to display, because there are many things going on with health. And just to explain a little what this health is all about, we use the Future America model, which is a dynamic competing risks model that we're going to fit in another very large set of auxiliary data sets. And we're going to do the same type of contrast. And the motivation for analyzing health is that in previous work of Professor Heckman and co-authors, we find some very strong effects in health that are new to this literature, because maybe the prior was that a preschool program at very early in life was not going to generate these very strong health effects. Okay, so this is saying how we construct the production function of the health outcome. So it's a first order Markov process in which we start forecasting your health at age 35 with the health that we observed at age 34, and so on, and we have the equivalent tests. But just to jump into the results, then crime is a whole other adventure, and let me just tell you what the results are. So just as the cost of the program would be $18,000 today, and this includes all the treatment from ages 0 to 8. Yearly. It's a very expensive program, so then that's partly the reason why the exercise of saying, what would be the return to a point of IQ in terms of labor income? That's an exercise often done. It's not going to get you too far, because you really need to account for the rest of the benefits of the experiment. Else you're going to find that the ratio is both very low and wrong if you consider the rest of the benefits of the program. So that's how we come back to this picture that we have here. This is an average. So the average participant of the program would have a net present value of $500,000 in terms of total benefits, and these are decomposed in labor income, parental income, crime, health, which are composed in an equivalent way. Yeah.
So you're looking after 50 kids, and you have to pay someone to do it, and you're paying that person $18,000 a year?
Well, it's much more than that. You have a center, their medical checkups. It's not a bunch of kids there and one teacher looking after them. They're actually teaching them skills, and that's how this program works.
It seems low. Have you accounted for?
So it's 18,000 times 50 is what you're saying.
That's why I wanted to back away. But at the same time, childcare costs have gone up faster than inflation since the 70s. You know into that.
Well, that number that I'm giving you would give you one of the highest costs of a childcare program today. So.
I mean, like, Educare is like $30,000 a year, if you count. That's including all the marginal cost of, adding, a building and a facility and health checkups and so forth. So you think that's low? Maybe it is. But then there's a whole discussion about child care workers are these early childhood workers are underpaid. So maybe this is another way to think about it.
What does the lab school charge for preschool?
A lot more. No, I know. No, go to New York City and you'll pay at least, for 2 hours a day, you'll get like $26,000 a year, something like that. So.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead. So this is decomposing this plot in the different counterfactuals of our interest. So this is treatment against next best, treatment against alternative preschool. And that's where we start finding some very interesting gender differences that align with some of the findings in the literature. But I want to show you how much time do I have?
You have 10 minutes.
Okay, so I want to show you, or at least give you a flavor of the type of robustness checks that we do in this paper. So a way to summarize this is with this butterfly, but another way to summarize it is in this table what we do is show the net present value of each of these components listed here, and then say okay, what would happen if I get rid of this component and re-estimate the cost-benefit ratio. And the spirit of this exercise is not show computing power, it's more to say there's a sense in which maybe parental income shouldn't be accounted here for, because at the same time that females are gaining more labor income, they're losing leisure. So if we don't know how to sign that well, or if we don't have a model to understand well what's the net gain of the parental income against the loss in leisure, then we might want to get rid of parental income altogether, and our results are going to survive to that comparison. Or in the literature, the way, or even forget about the literature, the way in which we're going to compute health costs relies a lot on the quality adjusted life years, because that's going to really tell you how much more a life is worth depending on your health conditions. That has some subjective value to it. We do a lot of further analysis to the subjectivity of this, but we might want to get rid of that altogether. And so on. For example, the crime costs, they're very strong. In these samples, you might think, well, 1 or 2 crimes are going to really push up a lot the cost-benefit ratio, because there are a few murders in the sample and in the sample and so on. It turns out that these types of very strong crimes are balanced across treatment and control, so that's not really going to matter, but the computation without the crime benefits is there too.
What does minus 11,304 mean on the medical expenditures? What is 11?
Okay.
What does the negative mean?
So this is the net present value of the expenditures that you did not make because of being in the treatment group.
So I saved $11,000 over my lifetime in medical expenses.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And then so then the way in which we obtain these distributions is we have robustness analysis and all type of exercises that you can imagine. Let's put it in a distribution and let's see how our preferred estimate or our benchmark estimate compares to the whole distribution, and it's really very close to the average. If you look here at the footnote of the table, this, Professor Heckman already went through this. These are kind of, the support is kind of compressed towards the mean there. But this is another important exercise that we're trying to get at in here. And I think if there's one lesson to this whole exercise that we have done is the following. So a few papers have studied the effect, let's say the effect of Head Start, and say like Head Start implies a gain of a quarter of a standard deviation in an IQ score. Great. Then they go to the paper by Chetty, and they say, well, this paper by Chetty is a fairly randomized experiment, and it also has data on labor income up to age 27. So let's take that gain of that experiment and suppose that the same gain is going to hold in our experiment. So for Chetty, an additional standard deviation in IQ gave a certain amount of dollars. So let's apply that return to IQ and compute the cost-benefit ratio. That's a shortcut to all of the stuff that we have done. We can do that. That's under the label Klein and Walter's method. If you're familiar with that paper, you would know why. But then we can also do the following. We can compute our own return to IQ. And if you see the costs of the program that we analyze, you're going to immediately infer that that return is going to be much lower. So that exercise is here. And then, but then we can also ask, okay, suppose that we would only have accounted for labor income up to age 27. So then we would have gotten this 1. So we would have passed the cost-benefit ratio test of being larger than 1, maybe not because of the inference. And then we go through these computations across the life cycle. So then we can say, okay, suppose we take labor income. Okay, now suppose we take labor income and the rest of the components that we analyze in our sample. And this might be an interesting comparison, these two here, because if you don't believe whatever we do after A star, then everything that we did up to A star relies very little on forecasting. So if we rely very little on forecasting, then we would have a cost-benefit ratio of 2. Things start looking better. And then if we account for the whole life cycle, income is not going to make the trip. But then if we consider all of the components, then the cost-benefit ratio is very high. And then
Benefit cost ratio.
Benefit cost.
The
Yeah.
benefit cost ratio.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's been a problem for decades, right? Everybody calls it cost benefit. It's really benefit cost.
okay, and then this is a way to graphically display the same thing. So so just to summarize, what we do here is, we have this seemingly ideal data set in which we observe almost everything to, we almost have an inappropriate amount of information about these individuals. We have their crime records and so on up to age 34. And even then, we are not able to compute a life cycle benefit cost ratio if we don't use some additional econometric and economic tools to forecast what the benefits are going to be in the future. We try to do that. We try to explain what are the implications, what's the robustness of these type of computations, and we come up with a number that we think is very robust to all of the assumptions implied in this exercise. Thank you.